Police, displaying image now.
Accident ahead.
Hello, retro gaming fans. It's going to take me a little bit to get used to saying that, as I'm used to saying indie fans, but I'm excited to talk about playing some different retro games of the past. I'm the Exhardcore Gamer, and today we're going to kick things off talking about Loadstar, the legend of Tully Bodine. Loadstar was a full-motion video on-rails shooter that was released in November of 1994 on the Sega CD, as well as 1995 on MS-DOS CD-ROM. For our worldwide viewers out there outside of North America, don't worry, I'm not being a self-centered American. It did technically only come out on the Sega CD in 1994, because although it was planned for a European release, it never ended up happening. It did later on get brought to Brazil by Tectoy in December of 1996, so I guess technically that would be a Mega CD release. While Loadstar, the Legend of Tully Bodine was originally intended to be the first release from new developer Rocket Science Games, it was being developed at the same time as Cadillacs and Dinosaurs: The Second Cataclysm, and that game actually ended up getting released shortly beforehand. Rocket Science Games would later go on to develop such games as Rocket Jockey, Obsidian, and the Spacebar, but unfortunately every single one of their releases were commercial failures. Rocket Science Games was one of many developers at the time that thought that they could bring Hollywood to video games. It was designed by Brian Moriarty, who authored 3 of the original Infocom interactive fiction titles, Wishbringer, Trinity, and Beyond Zork, as well as Loom for LucasArts. On top of that, it was based on a script by Ron Cobb, who is a famous concept artist in Hollywood. He worked on movies such as Star Wars, Alien, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Conan the Barbarian, Back to the Future, The Abyss, Total Recall, and, if you've been paying attention to some things that are going on in this channel, True Lies. Why would a concept artist be writing a script? Well, he did actually contribute the initial story for Night Skies, which was an unproduced science fiction horror movie in the late 70s. Steven Spielberg conceived the idea after working on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and the studio wanted a sequel. It didn't end up getting made, but over time the material was worked into both Poltergeist and E.T., and arguably even Gremlins. Not only was the script of Ron Cobb used, but he also did a lot of concept art whose designs made its way into the final game as well. But he wasn't the only part of Hollywood that made it in. You need actors to be able to do the scenes for full motion video. The cast includes names such as Ned Beatty, who plays Sheriff Francis Wampler. You may know him from Deliverance, All the President's Men, and Network, as well as Superman 1 and 2, and Captain America, the 1990 version. It also has Barry Primus, who plays the lead character of Tully Bodine, while most recently and famously in The Irishman, you may also recognize him from American Hustle, a favorite of mine, Space Camp, and many other roles and guest spots on TV shows. The cast continues on with people that you go, hey, it's that guy, like Michael J. Anderson and Tony Cox, who both play bartenders. Unfortunately, since acting was such a new concept in video games at the time, when they were doing the shoot for Loadstar in Los Angeles, TV producer Matthew Fassberg was working on the set and had to rent several Sega game machines to help some of the actors understand why they had to shoot so many different scenes. They wanted to know why there were so many different endings. He was quoted as saying, "We had to explain that if someone doesn't do well on this level, that they die. If not, they go on, so you need to record a whole lot of different outcomes." Something that we take for granted now, but was a very foreign concept at the time. So what is the game actually about? Well, it's about Tully Bodine, the best space trucker in the business, who takes a dangerous job of getting contraband camels off of Moon Colony to Phobos. With the help of his computer navigator, he must evade rivals and authorities. Basically, you have to deliver some goods, and you're on these rails, literally, that go around on this kind of monorail type system to be able to deliver the goods. Unfortunately, you have kind of a reputation, and while you want to do one last job before you retire, the sheriff is having none of it and he wants you off. This creates a little bit of a time limit, as you have to quickly get things delivered before you die. Your job is to steer around on these rails to be able to get to your destination while avoiding being shot at by enemies, as well as avoiding police and other objects that are going to block your path. This means that you can die from taking too much damage, crashing into something, or running out of time. There is a bit of a compass that can help you figure out which way you're steering, but it does get a little bit confusing, and you end up trying to just make sure that you can keep the destination in your view as you go around. but you can end up going in circles. Due to the limitations of the footage that's used, some of the places can look very similar to each other, and that could lead to the confusion as well. The major downfall of the design of Loadstar is unfortunately in its controls. As we all know, the Genesis and Mega Drive controller only had one D-pad, and unfortunately that needs to be used to both control where you're aiming and steering. You have to control a cursor that moves around to aim where you're shooting, but also has to be moved to the extreme sides of the screen that you want to turn in. This leads you to shooting at enemies and taking turns that you don't want to, or if you are specifically turning, you can't aim at the enemy that's shooting you on the opposite side of the screen. While you do have a shield that can be used to help protect you, this isn't something that you should have to use just to be able to take a turn. Fans of Sewer Shark may find themselves feeling right at home while playing this, as there are a lot of similarities between the two games. Unfortunately, I think that Sewer Shark definitely handled the steering better, as well as making it easier to know where you needed to go next. Previous control issues aside, the game does control rather simply. The A button is to honk your horn when you have a vehicle that's up in front of you that's going a bit slow and you need it to move out of your way. The B button is your defensive shots that can shoot enemies' attacks away from you, and the C button is your main attack that you will use to take out the enemies. Unfortunately, this brings up another aspect of the game that is negative, and that's the fact that you don't actually see anything firing out when you press the button. The cursor does kind of change shape a little bit, so you kind of think that you're doing something, but you're not really sure until you see the enemies disappear, so sometimes you question if you're even doing the right thing. As I mentioned before, there is a shield, and this can be activated by pressing both the B and C buttons together if you have a 3-button controller, or the Z button if you have a 6-button. It should be noted that even when using a 6-button controller, pressing both B and C at the same time will activate it, so it might be done by accident. Loadstar does use the internal memory to save what level that you're on, but it's only going to be able to let you start at the beginning. You can't save within a level. Speaking of levels, there are only 3 in Loadstar, which I don't think I need to tell you is not a lot. I guess having 90 minutes of original footage used in the game took up most of the space, and they didn't have room to add more levels. Level 3 does add one more weapon where you can shoot everybody on screen at the same time without aiming by pressing both A and B together, or the X button if you have a 6-button controller. But unfortunately, I never got to witness this myself. Because of the previously mentioned design flaws, I just found the game way too frustrating, and despite hours of playing, I wasn't even able to complete level 1. I constantly found myself needlessly turning in circles and being unclear of where I needed to go next, and just finding all the different kill scenes because I was finding every which way to die, because it just was not that easy to play. Look, I am all for a good challenge in an old game. I know we're going back to games at a time that had different sensibilities, but this is just poor design and not something that's actually fun to try to get yourself to be better at. I did in fact have a Sega CD as a kid growing up, but I did not own Loadstar at the time. But it seems I wasn't alone, as the game was a huge failure. It was intended to be the first of a trilogy, with parts 2 and 3 planned to release in 1995, but that never happened, obviously. While doing some research before doing this review, I was able to get a little bit of a peek behind the scenes about how the fact that Sega themselves had heavily invested in rocket science games, and they demanded that the game appear first on its system. But unfortunately, it's that system that severely hobbled what the game could be, just due to its limitations. Brian Moriarty himself talked about the failures of Loadstar, saying that the Sega CD version that was shipped was pretty much the first version that we produced that had no obvious bugs. To pass Sega's testing procedure, it simply had to play for a certain number of hours without crashing, and it could do this, just barely. But then there was no quality control as such. There was no play testing. No one bothered to find out if it played any good. No one spent any time trying to make it fun, and although it passed the tests, all the Sega people hated it. So yes, the game did come out first on Sega CD, and they were able to do some impressive things like make the full motion video full screen, which wasn't common at the time, but it was still super grainy and obviously had all the issues we talked about before. Fast forward to the CD-ROM version, and you no longer had Sega's restrictions, and they were able to put it out on 3 CDs instead of 1. This allowed for higher quality video, an extra level, and every level also had bosses. Another major change when it came to the PC CD-ROM version is the fact that now the aiming and the steering are separate controls. You aim with a mouse, which is now also better because of the fact that it's analog control, and then you use the arrow keys on the keyboard to turn. This means that you can shoot and steer whichever way you want to go. I would imagine this made for a much more enjoyable experience, but as a DOS game on CD that's not available on any digital platforms, I wasn't able to test it out for myself for review purposes. Sometimes you'll hear about a game after the fact that was a colossal failure and you'll feel bad for it and wish that it got a second chance. Unfortunately, I don't think that Loadstar: The Legend of Tully Bodine is one of those games. Yes, there was an announcement that it was going to come to the 3DO, as well as Sega CD 32X and Saturn, and none of those versions came out. No official reason was given, but I think it's safe to say that it's because of the poor sales of Loadstar, and also probably those platforms as well. But maybe one day we'll be able to play it on our Teslas. As fun little fact for those of you that have stuck around this long, Elon Musk worked on Loadstar as a programmer. He's credited as part of the ground control team. Now, obviously, I don't really think that it's going to be playable on a Tesla, and I don't think that it'll probably have any chance of ever getting re-released ever, but never say never, and maybe it's better off that way.